He can't keep food down. He's a dead man. So tonight we decide who buries him and takes what's left. Leonard Crowe raised his glass, and the room full of killers laughed with him. Across the city, the most feared boss in New York hurled a porcelain plate against the wall. It exploded like a gunshot, and not one of his men dared breathe. Adrian Moretti was starving to death in a mansion full of food. 3 world-famous chefs dismissed. 6 specialists useless. His hands shaking, his empire cracking, his enemies already circling the corpse. Then a maid who'd arrived that very morning picked up the cheapest spoon in the kitchen and did what no fortune could. Before we go on, if stories about second chances move you, please subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The porcelain plate shattered against the stone fireplace, and every man standing along the walls of the dining room flinched, though not one of them dared move. Adrian Moretti stood at the head of the long table with both hands, pressed flat against the wood, breathing hard. He was pale in a way that money could not fix. His shirt, tailored to a body that had been strong 6 months ago, now hung loose at the collar. His cheeks had hollowed. His hands, the hands that had once ended arguments and lives, would not stop trembling. "Take it away," he said quietly. "Take all of it away." The chef stepped forward, a celebrated man who had cooked for senators and film stars, a man who had flown across an ocean to work in this house. "Mr. Moretti, please, just 3 more bites," the doctor said. "I don't care what the doctor said. With respect, sir, this dish took." I said, "Take it away." The chef's mouth closed. He gathered the ruined plate from the floor with careful hands, and he did not speak again. He had watched 2 other chefs be dismissed from this house in the last month, and he understood now that he would be the 3rd. What he did not understand, what none of them understood, was that the food was flawless. The problem was not the food. The problem was that Adrian Moretti could not swallow. For 5 months it had been getting worse. He would sit down hungry, truly hungry, and lift a single forkful to his mouth, and then his stomach would close like a fist. The smell of rich sauce made his throat tighten. The sight of meat turned his stomach. He had lost so much weight that his own tailor had stopped meeting his eyes during fittings, and the men in his organization had noticed. That was the part that kept him awake. Not the pain, the men. He turned from the fireplace and looked down the length of the table at the empty chairs, and he thought about how quickly loyalty curdled when a leader looked weak. He thought about Leonard Crowe, who had been whispering to Adrian's own associates for weeks now, planting the same soft poison in every ear. "He's dying. He's finished. Get close to me now, and you'll be standing when the dust clears." Adrian knew the game because he had played it himself years ago against older men who had underestimated him. "Helen," he said. The head of household staff stepped away from the wall. Helen Brooks had served this table for 15 years. She had a stillness about her that came from surviving a great deal, and she alone in this room did not seem afraid of him tonight. "Sir, is there anyone else in this house who can cook?" Helen hesitated. "The kitchen staff, sir, but they work under the chef, and the chef is gone." Adrian pressed a hand to his stomach, then lowered it, hating that anyone had seen. "Anyone, a dishwasher, a groundskeeper. I don't care about credentials. I want someone to make me one thing I can actually eat before I lose my mind." Helen's eyes moved just slightly toward the kitchen door. "You have someone in mind," Adrian said. It was not a question. "There's a new maid, sir. She started this morning. Grace Holloway." Helen chose her words with the caution of a woman diffusing something delicate. "She isn't a cook. She cleans. But when I brought her through the kitchen this morning, she said something." "What did she say?" "She looked at all that food the chef was preparing, all those sauces and creams, and she said, 'None of this is for a sick man. This is for a healthy man who wants to feel important.'" The room was very quiet. Adrian stared at the door. "Bring her to me." Helen went, and the men along the walls exchanged looks, and Adrian sat down slowly at the head of the table because standing had begun to cost him more than he wanted to admit. The woman who came through the door a minute later was nothing to look at by the standards of that house. Her uniform was cheap and a little too large. Her hair was pulled back plainly. She was perhaps 35, maybe a few years older, with tired eyes and rough hands, the hands of a person who had done real work her whole life. She stopped a respectful distance from the table and folded those hands in front of her and waited. She did not tremble. Adrian noticed that at once because everyone trembled in front of him now, either from fear of him or from pity, and he had grown to hate both. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "I know enough to be careful," Grace Holloway said. One of the men near the wall made a small sound, almost a laugh, and quickly swallowed it. Adrian did not look at him. That's an honest answer, Adrian said. Most people either pretend they don't know, or they fall all over themselves trying to prove they do. I'm not most people, sir. I just started this morning. Helen tells me you have opinions about food. Grace glanced at Helen, who gave the smallest shake of her head, a warning. Grace looked back at Adrian and visibly decided, to tell the truth anyway. I had one opinion, sir, that the food I saw this morning wasn't cooked for you. It was cooked to impress people who might hear about it later. And you think you can do better? No, sir. I know I can't cook better than a man who trained for 20 years. I only think I might cook something you can eat, which is a different thing. Adrian leaned back. For the first time in days, something other than dread moved through him. Curiosity. Then cook it. Cook whatever you want. The kitchen is yours. Grace nodded and turned toward the door. Then she stopped, and she turned back, and she asked the question that made the whole room go still. Before I do, I need to know one thing, she said. Am I cooking for a hungry man or for a man who is hurting? The men along the walls went rigid. It was the kind of question no one asked Adrian Moretti. It cut past everything, past the mansion and the guards, and the name that made grown men careful. It reached in and touched the thing he had told no one. Adrian could have destroyed her for it. Everyone in the room understood that. Helen actually took half a step forward, as if to physically place herself between the maid and whatever was about to happen. But Adrian did not raise his voice. He sat very still, and something in his face that had been locked shut for a long time seemed to shift, just slightly, like a door that has not been opened in years. Why do you ask it that way? He said finally. Because you feed the two of them differently, Grace said. A hungry man you fill up. A hurting man you have to coax back. If I bring the wrong food to the wrong man, I've wasted both our time. The silence stretched long enough that one of the men shifted his weight, and the floor creaked. Cook for the man who is hurting, Adrian said. And the moment the words left his mouth, he could not believe he had said them. He had not admitted that to the doctors. He had not admitted it to himself. But he had said it out loud, to a stranger in a cheap uniform, because something in the plain way she asked had made lying feel more exhausting than the truth. Grace nodded once, as though he had told her nothing more remarkable than his shoe size, and she went into the kitchen. She did not touch the imported truffles, or the aged cuts of beef, or the little jars of things that cost more than most people made in a week. She walked past all of it. She found a chicken, and carrots, and celery, and an onion, and plain salt, and a handful of parsley, and half a loaf of day-old bread that the staff had been about to throw out. Behind the gleaming copper pots that hung on the wall for show, she found a dented old pot that someone had shoved out of sight because it was ugly. She pulled it out and set it on the stove. Helen had followed her in and stood watching from the doorway. You're making broth, Helen said. I'm making broth. He's had the finest food in the world put in front of him. Chefs from 3 countries, I know. And you think chicken broth is going to do what they couldn't? Grace didn't stop moving. She was cleaning the chicken, cutting the vegetables into rough, honest pieces, filling the pot with water. I don't think the broth is going to do anything, ma'am. The broth is just broth. But my mother spent 30 years nursing dying people, and she taught me something. When a body has decided to shut the door on food, you don't kick the door down. You knock, real soft, with something the body remembers from before it got scared. She looked up. Somewhere in there is a version of that man that used to eat without being afraid. I'm just trying to reach him. Helen said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, you talk like you've done this before. Grace's hand slowed just for a second on the knife. I have. She did not say more, and Helen did not push, and the 2 women stood together in the warm kitchen while the broth began to simmer, and the smell of it, plain and clean and old as childhood, filled the room. An hour later, Grace ladled the broth into a simple white bowl. She did not add cream or garnish or any of the flourishes the last 3 chefs had used to make their food look like art. She wiped the rim of the bowl clean with a cloth. And then, instead of a soup spoon, she took a small teaspoon from the drawer and set it on the tray beside the bowl. Helen frowned. That's the wrong spoon. No, ma'am. That's the right spoon. Grace picked up the tray. A big spoon feels like a demand. It says, eat all of this, prove you can. A little spoon feels like a choice. It says, just try this much. And if that's all you can do, that's all right. She turned toward the door. A hurting man needs to feel like he's allowed to stop. She carried the tray into the dining room herself. Adrian was still at the head of the table. The men had thinned out. He looked up when she came in, and his eyes went to the tray. And something crossed his face when he saw the plain bowl and the tiny spoon. He did not say what it was. He watched her set it down in front of him. Broth, he said flatly. Broth. I've eaten in the finest restaurants on 3 continents. Yes, sir, I heard. And you brought me the kind of thing you feed to a child. I brought you the kind of thing you feed to someone you love who's afraid to eat, Grace said. Sometimes that's a child. Sometimes it isn't. Adrian looked at the bowl for a long time. And here is what he did not tell her, what he had not told anyone. The smell coming off that plain white bowl was not the smell of a 5-star kitchen. It was the smell of a small apartment 30 years ago, of a woman standing at a stove with her sleeves pushed up, of a boy sitting at a chipped table waiting to be fed. It was the smell of his mother who had died of stomach cancer 10 years ago. His mother, who in her final months could not eat, who had wasted away in front of him while he stood there with all the money and all the power in the world and could not put a single spoonful of anything into her body that she could keep down. He had watched every meal become another small funeral. He had learned that there were things his empire could not buy, and the lesson had nearly broken him. And now here he was, 5 months into his own body turning against him, 5 months of pushing food away, and some private, terrified part of him had become absolutely certain that he was dying exactly the way she had died. That was the truth underneath everything. The doctors said ulcer. The doctors said stress, gastritis, a condition that was serious but treatable. And Adrian had nodded and taken none of it in, because in the dark at 3 a.m, he was sure they were being kind to a dead man. He picked up the little teaspoon. His hands shook. He steadied it against the edge of the bowl, ashamed, and he did not look at Grace. And he dipped the spoon and lifted a small amount of broth and put it in his mouth. He waited for his stomach to close, for the familiar fist, for the nausea that had ruined every meal for 5 months. It did not come. The broth was warm and simple, and it tasted like being small and safe and cared for, and his stomach, for the first time and longer than he could remember, did not fight him. He sat very still, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that if he moved too fast, his body would remember to be sick. He took another spoonful. Grace did not react. She did not smile or lean forward or say anything encouraging. She stood a few feet back with her hands folded and simply let him eat, the way you let a frightened animal come to your hand in its own time. She understood in a way no one in that mansion had understood in 5 months, that the worst thing she could do right now was make it a performance. Adrian ate a third spoonful, a fourth. Somewhere behind him, Helen pressed her fingers to her mouth. He did not eat fast, he could not, but he did not stop. And slowly, spoonful by small spoonful, the bowl emptied, and when he had scraped the last of it, he set the little spoon down and put both hands flat on the table again. But this time, not because he was about to be sick. This time, because he was steadying something inside himself that had nothing to do with his stomach. He had eaten a whole bowl of food. He had not done that in 5 months. How, he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. How did you do that? I didn't do anything, sir, Grace said. You did. I just made it easier for you to say yes. Adrian turned his chair to look at her fully, and he studied her the way he studied men across negotiating tables, looking for the angle, the ask, the moment where she would reveal what she really wanted. Everyone wanted something from him. That had been the shape of his entire life. People smiled and cooked and complimented, and it was all a road that led to money, or safety, or power, or his name. He waited for it. Grace picked up the empty bowl and the little spoon and set them back on the tray. Is there anything else, sir? That was all. She did not ask for a raise. She did not remind him that she had done what 3 world-famous chefs could not. She did not so much as glance at the wealth all around her. She just gathered the dishes and prepared to go back to work, as if she had cleaned a room rather than cracked open a door he had bolted shut a decade ago. And that, more than the broth, was what undid him. Wait, Adrian said. She stopped. He looked at the little teaspoon on the tray. He looked at it for a long time. Breakfast, he said. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Yes, sir. He nodded at the tray. Bring that spoon again. Something passed over her face then, some flicker of recognition, as though she knew exactly why he had asked for that particular spoon and had been waiting to see if he would. She inclined her head. I'll bring the spoon, sir. She carried the tray out, and Adrian Moretti sat alone at the head of a table built for 20, in a house full of men whose loyalty was draining away by the day, and he did something he had not done in a very long time. He let himself hope. That night the house did not run the way it always ran. The phone in Adrian's study rang and rang. Important men wanted to speak with him. Deals hung waiting. A shipment needed a decision. A dispute in the south end of the city needed his word before it turned into something worse. Victor Hale, the man who handled the things that needed handling, waited outside the study door for orders that did not come. Adrian sat in the dark with a cold cup of tea he had not touched and did not think about any of it. He thought about his mother. He thought about the last bowl of soup she had ever managed to eat and how she had smiled at him afterward, that thin, exhausted smile, and told him she wasn't afraid. He had believed her because he needed to. He thought about how, in the years after she died, he had built and built and built walls and businesses and reputation and fear, on the theory that if he became powerful enough, nothing would ever be able to take anything from him again. And then his own body had started taking things from him anyway. One meal at a time, and all the power in the world had done nothing. Until a maid with a dented pot and a teaspoon had walked in, and without meaning to, without knowing anything about his mother at all, had set a bowl in front of him that smelled like the only time in his life he had ever felt completely safe. He did not sleep much that night, but for the first time in weeks he was not lying awake because he was afraid of dying. He was lying awake, wondering, cautiously, almost guiltily, whether he might actually want to live. Down in the staff quarters, Grace Holloway sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a small plain room and could not settle either. She had promised herself when she took this job that she would keep her head down, clean the rooms, take the wages, ask no questions, learn no secrets, and above all, stay out of the way of whatever this family was and whatever they did. She had known Ravenwood was dangerous the moment she saw the men along the walls with their careful eyes. She had spent one single day here, and already she had done the exact opposite of everything she had promised herself. She had walked into a dining room and looked the most feared man in the house in the eye and asked him whether he was hurting. She did not fully understand why she had done it, except that she did, and she was just afraid to say it, even to herself. 10 years ago, in a small kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, her mother had said something to her, near the end when the pancreatic cancer had finally worn her down to almost nothing. Lillian Holloway had spent 30 years as a hospice nurse, 30 years feeding people that everyone else had given up feeding, 30 years learning that the smallest spoon could do what the strongest medicine could not. And at the end of all of it, she had held her daughter's hand and made her promise something. When I'm gone, feed someone who has forgotten that life is still waiting for them. Grace had said yes. Of course she had said yes. And then her mother had died, and grief had closed over Grace like water. And she had found that she could not so much as stand in a kitchen without her chest caving in. Every pot, every knife, every smell was her mother. She had left Savannah because she could not bear it. She had come north and found work cleaning, because cleaning did not have a smell that broke her heart. She had let the promise sit unkept for 10 years, telling herself she would fulfill it someday, when it hurt less. It had never hurt less. And then this morning, she had walked through a rich man's kitchen and seen a spread of food built to impress, and behind all of it she had seen, somehow, a man who was starving in the middle of plenty, a man who had forgotten that life was still waiting for him. And something her mother had put into her a long time ago had risen up before she could stop it, and here she was. Grace lay back on the narrow bed. "I don't know what I'm doing, Mama," she whispered to the dark. "I don't know what kind of house I've walked into. I don't even know what that man has done to be as feared as he is." She closed her eyes. But he ate the whole bowl. He ate the whole bowl, and he asked for the spoon. She did not know yet how dangerous this house truly was. She did not know about Leonard Crowe sitting in a back room across the city, raising a glass to Adrian Moretti's death. She did not know that within weeks there would be strangers offering money for her schedule, or that a bottle would be placed in that kitchen meant to make her look like a murderer, or that she would one day stand in a doorway and watch Adrian Moretti decide, with his whole soul hanging in the balance, whether he was still the kind of man who could kill. She knew none of that yet. All she knew, lying in the dark that first night, was that she had made a promise to a dying woman 10 years ago, and that today, without planning to, without being ready, she had finally started to keep it. And upstairs, in a study full of ringing phones he would not answer, the most powerful man in that house held a memory of his mother in one hand and a stranger's kindness in the other, and understood that something had changed tonight that could not be changed back. He did not know what it would cost him. He did not know that the same recovery bringing him back to life would soon make him a target. That the moment his enemies saw him eating again, walking again, giving orders again, they would stop planning to inherit his empire and start planning to take it. He only knew that tomorrow at 7 o'clock, a quiet woman was going to bring him a bowl of broth and a little teaspoon, and that for reasons he could not fully explain, he was already counting the hours. He picked up the phone at last, near midnight, and Victor answered on the first ring. tense, waiting. Sir, there are decisions. They'll keep until morning, Adrian said. There was a startled silence on the line. In all the years Victor had worked for him, Adrian had never once said that decisions would keep. Sir, are you all right? Adrian looked out the dark window toward the wing of the house where the staff slept, where a maid he had met that very day was lying awake with her own ghosts. Neither of them yet knowing how completely their lives had just collided. I ate today, Victor, Adrian said quietly, a whole bowl. That's good, sir. That's real good. Yeah. Adrian set the cold tea aside. Get some sleep. We've got a long road ahead. He hung up before Victor could ask what he meant. The truth was, Adrian did not entirely know what he meant himself. He only knew that the road ahead was going to be longer and harder and more dangerous than anyone in that house could yet imagine, and that for the first time in 5 months, he intended to be alive at the end of it. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Grace Holloway carried a tray up the wide staircase with a bowl of soft eggs, a small dish of oatmeal, a cup of mild tea, and a little teaspoon resting beside it all. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. She had bleak half the night, wondering if the man who ate a whole bowl of broth would remember, in the cold light of morning, that he had asked a maid whether he was hurting and hate her for having heard the answer. She need not have worried about that. Adrian Moretti was already awake, already dressed, already sitting at the small table by the window in his private rooms, and when she came in, he looked at the tray before he looked at her. You brought the spoon, he said. You asked me to, sir. Something in his shoulders eased. He gestured to the chair across from him, which surprised her, because staff did not sit in the presence of Adrian Moretti. She hesitated. Sit, he said. I'm not going to eat while a person stands over me watching. I've had enough of being watched. She sat. She set the tray between them and pushed the eggs toward him, not the oatmeal first. Because eggs were gentler on a stomach that had been in a war for 5 months, and she said nothing about that. She just arranged it, so the easiest thing was closest to his hand. He picked up the little spoon and ate. It went slower than the broth had. Eggs were more than broth, and twice his stomach tightened, and he set the spoon down and pressed his hand flat to his ribs and breathed through it. And both times Grace did not rush to fix it. She waited. And both times the fist unclenched, and he picked the spoon back up and he kept going. He got through most of the eggs, and a little of the oatmeal, and all of the tea before he stopped. It was not a lot of food, but it was food, and it stayed down, and when he pushed the tray back, he looked almost dazed by it, like a man who had been told for months that a door was locked and had just watched it swing open. Twice in 2 days, he said quietly. Yes, sir, you understand what that means to me? Grace chose her words with care. I understand what it means to a body that forgot how. Whether it means more than that, sir, I couldn't say. That's yours to know. Adrian studied her across the little table. You keep doing that. Doing what? Refusing to take credit. Every chef I ever hired wanted me to know exactly how brilliant they were. You act like you carried a tray up some stairs. I did carry a tray up some stairs. He almost smiled, almost. It had been a long time since his face remembered how. There's something I need to be clear about, he said, and his voice shifted into something harder, more like the voice the rest of the house knew. Whatever this is, whatever you did, I want you to hear me say the thing you're too polite to say. I am not well. I've had 6 specialists in this house. They all say the same words: ulcer, stress, gastritis. They say it's serious, but it's treatable, and I have been treating it like a man treats advice from people he's decided are lying to him. Grace went still. Why would they lie to you? And there it was, the question that opened everything, and this time Adrian did not dodge it the way he had dodged the doctors. My mother died of stomach cancer, he said, 10 years ago. At the end, she couldn't eat. Nothing. She wasted down to nothing in front of me, and I had every doctor money could buy, and not one of them could get a spoonful of food to stay in her body. He turned the little teaspoon slowly on the table with one finger. So when I stopped being able to eat, I decided I already knew what it was. I decided the specialists were being kind to a dead man. That's why nothing worked. Not because the food was wrong, because I'd already made up my mind to die. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that landed harder than anything the 6 specialists had managed. Your mother wasn't afraid of the food, she said. By the end, was she? Adrian's head came up sharply. What? I nursed people at the end, sir, through my mother. When it's really the cancer, the body just stops. There's no fear in it. There's no fighting the spoon. But you fight the spoon. Every bite yesterday and every bite today, you brace like it's going to hurt you, and then it doesn't. And you're surprised every single time. She held his eyes. A dying body doesn't get surprised that it can eat, sir. A frightened one does. I think your doctors are telling you the truth. I think you've been grieving your mother for 10 years. And your body finally started grieving with you and you mistook one for the other. The room was silent. Somewhere in the house, a phone rang and went unanswered. Adrian Moretti, who had ended men for less than what this maid had just said to his face, sat perfectly still and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed for a decade. Get Dr. Lawson on the phone, he said finally, and his voice was rough. Rebecca Lawson. She's been trying to see me for 3 weeks. Tell her I'll see her today. Grace nodded and stood and gathered the tray. Grace. Sir, if you're wrong about this, he said, if I do what these doctors say and it turns out I really am dying, I need you to know I won't hold it against you. She looked at him steadily. And if I'm right, sir? He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. She saw the answer move across his face, and she carried the tray out before either of them had to name it. Dr. Rebecca Lawson came that afternoon, a brisk gray-haired woman who did not seem the least bit impressed by the mansion or by the man in it. And that was exactly why Adrian had always half-trusted her, against his own instinct not to trust anyone. She examined him. She read the reports from the 6 specialists. She asked him blunt questions and got, for once, honest answers, because something had loosened in him that morning at a small table over a plate of soft eggs. When she was done, she sat back and looked at him and said the words plainly. You have a peptic ulcer and severe stress-related gastritis. It is real, it is serious, and it is absolutely treatable. You are not dying, Adrian. You are, however, doing a very thorough job of trying. She ticked it off on her finger. You take the medication I prescribe, every dose on time. You stop drinking entirely. You cut the coffee down to almost nothing. You eat small and often on a fixed schedule instead of these enormous meals you keep pushing away. And you find a way to reduce the stress that's pouring acid into an open wound in your stomach every single day. Do those things and you'll heal. Don't, and you'll perforate it, and then you really will be dying. And it'll be your own doing. Adrian took it. All of it. For the first time in 5 months, he took the medicine when he was told and did not pour himself a drink at night. And it was harder than anyone in that house understood, because the drink and the coffee and the punishing schedule were how a man like Adrian Moretti had run himself for 20 years. And Grace cooked. She and Dr. Lawson worked out a plan together, which Grace insisted on, because she would not put a single spoonful in front of that man without a doctor standing behind it. Soft eggs, oatmeal broth, plain rice, baked fish that fell apart under a fork, steamed vegetables cut small, mild tea, nothing rich, nothing sharp, nothing that would wake the wound. Small portions, 5 and 6 times a day on a schedule she kept like a clock. She was careful, over and over, to say the one thing out loud. I'm not a doctor, sir, she told him at least once a day. I can give you food your body might accept, but you still have to let Dr. Lawson do her part. The food opens the door. The medicine does the healing. Don't you ever confuse the two? Adrian did not like being told what to do by anyone, let alone an employee, and there were days he snapped at her. Days the old hardness came back into his voice, and he ordered her out of the room. And Grace would go, without arguing, and come back at the next scheduled meal as if nothing had happened, tray in hand, spoon in place, and set it down in front of him, and wait. She did not flinch from his temper, and she did not feed it either. She just kept showing up with the next bowl. 10 days passed, and Adrian Moretti got better. It was slow. It was not a miracle, and Grace never once let anyone call it one. But he slept through the night now. His hands stopped trembling. He sat through meetings without pressing a fist to his stomach halfway through. The color came back into his face by degrees. His clothes stopped hanging quite so loose. And the men in his organization, the men who had been quietly measuring him for a coffin, watched their leader walk back into the world, one steady meal at a time, and did not know what to make of it. Some of them started treating Grace like she was something more than a maid, like she had power, like she was a witch or a healer or a woman who knew a secret. She hated it. Stop that, she told Victor Hale flatly one morning when she caught him and 2 other men watching her carry a tray with something close to superstition on their faces. I didn't do anything. There's no magic in that bowl. That man got the right diagnosis from 6 different doctors before I ever set foot in this house. What he didn't have was trust. He didn't trust the doctors, he didn't trust the food, and he didn't trust that he had any future left worth eating for. All I did was give him something small enough to say yes. That's not power. That's just paying attention. Any one of you could have done it if you'd stopped being afraid of him long enough to look. Victor, who had been afraid of Adrian Moretti for 11 years, did not know what to say to that. But it was Adrian himself who became most curious about her, And it happened slowly, over those small meals, in the quiet space that opens up between two people when one of them keeps feeding the other and neither of them is performing. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked her one evening, over a plate of baked fish. "The spoons, the schedule, the way you never push. That's not something a person picks up cleaning houses." Grace was quiet a moment. She had known this question was coming, and she had dreaded it, because to answer it she had to open the door she'd kept shut for 10 years. "My mother," she said finally, "Lillian Holloway. She was a hospice nurse in Georgia for 30 years. A hospice nurse. The end of life, sir. When people are dying and everyone else has stopped trying. She fed people that the doctors had given up on. Not to cure them, there was no curing them. Just so they wouldn't leave this world feeling like a burden nobody wanted to bother with." Grace's voice had gone soft. She figured out all the little things. The small spoon, so it feels like a choice. The half portion, so nobody feels like they failed. Sitting beside somebody without pushing, so eating doesn't feel like a test they have to pass. 30 years she did that. She was the best I ever saw. Was Adrian said cancer? 10 years ago. Grace looked down at her hands. The nurse who spent her whole life feeding the dying, and at the end her own body wouldn't take the food. And I sat with her the way she taught me to sit with people, with the small spoon, and I fed her a little at a time. And it wasn't enough to save her. Nothing was going to save her, but she wasn't afraid at the end. I made sure she wasn't afraid. Adrian had gone very still, because it was his own story, turned inside out. He had sat beside his dying mother and had been able to do nothing. Grace had sat beside hers and had known exactly what to do. And both of them had lost her anyway. Before she died, Grace went on, and her voice caught. And she pushed through it. She made me promise something. She held my hand and she said, "When I'm gone, feed someone who has forgotten that life is still waiting for them." She let out a shaky breath, and I said yes. And then she died and I couldn't do it. I couldn't even walk into a kitchen, sir. 10 years. Every pot, every knife, every smell was hers, so I ran. I left Savannah, I came up north, and I took cleaning work because you don't have to cook to clean. I told myself I'd keep the promise someday, when it stopped hurting so bad. She looked up at him and her eyes were wet and steady. It never stopped hurting. And then I walked into your kitchen my first morning here, and I saw a man in the middle of everything money can buy who'd forgotten that life was still waiting for him. And 10 years of a promise I'd been running from just walked me right into that dining room. The room was silent. Adrian Moretti set down his spoon. "That's why you asked me," he said slowly. "That first night, whether I was hurting. That's why I asked." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that Grace had not seen there before, something almost like grief shared, and then it hardened over and shut, and he stood up abruptly and said he had calls to make and left the room. She thought she had said too much. She thought she had let him too far in. She was wrong about what he did next, and she would not forgive him for it easily. Because Adrian Moretti, who had spent 20 years surviving by never taking anyone at their word, went to Victor Hale that same night and told him to investigate Grace Holloway. Every word she'd said. Her mother, the hospice, Savannah, all of it. A woman had walked into his private home and cracked open the most protected part of him in 11 days, and every instinct he had built his life on screamed that no one did that by accident, that this was a play, that she wanted something, and that he was a fool getting soft over a bowl of soup. Victor came back 3 days later with a file. Everything checked out. Lillian Holloway, hospice nurse, 31 years of service in and around Savannah, Georgia. Died of pancreatic cancer. Survived by a daughter, Grace, who had left the state shortly after and drifted north through a string of cleaning jobs. Every single thing Grace had told him was true. Down to the details she'd been too grief-struck to embellish. Adrian read the file with a strange, sick feeling that he had not expected. A feeling that got worse the further he read, because reading it did not make him feel safer. It made him feel like a thief. And then Grace found the file. She was cleaning his study, which was her job, and it was sitting on the desk open, her mother's name at the top of it, her mother's death reduced to a line of type, her whole grief flattened into a background check. She stood there holding it, and Adrian came in and saw her holding it, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "You investigated me," Grace said. Her voice was very quiet, which was worse than if she'd shouted. "Grace, you took what I told you about my mother, the thing I hadn't told anybody in 10 years, and you handed it to a man to go dig around in." She set the file down on the desk, carefully, like it might break, or like she might. "You put my mother's death in a folder. Anyone who comes into this house," Adrian said, and his voice was hard, defensive, Could be an assassin. Could be an informant sent by my enemies. Grace, you don't understand the world I live in. People have been sent into this house before to get close to me. A pretty story about a dying mother is exactly the kind of thing they'd build. I had to be sure. You had the right to protect yourself, Grace said, and her voice shook now, but not with fear. You did. I'm not saying you didn't. Somebody in your position checking on a stranger who walked into your home, I understand that. She took a step toward him. But you didn't have the right to sit across a table from me and let me tell you about the worst day of my life and hold my hand with your eyes and let me think you were listening as a person. And all the time you were already planning to send a man to verify it. You could have just asked me. You could have said, Grace, I need to check your story. That's how I stay alive. And I'd have said, check it, I've got nothing to hide. But you didn't ask. You turned my mother's death into a document without telling me. And that's not protecting yourself, sir. That's something else. No one had ever spoken to Adrian Moretti like that in his own house and lived comfortably afterward. The men who overheard it, and some did, went pale and found reasons to be elsewhere. They waited for the explosion. It did not come. Adrian Moretti stood there and took it, and the worst part, the part that shook him, was that she was right. He had told himself it was about safety, and some of it was, but he could have asked. He had chosen not to ask because asking would have meant treating her like a person he owed honesty to, and treating people like they were owed honesty was a habit he had beaten out of himself 20 years ago in order to survive. You're right, Grace blinked. I could have asked, and you're right about why. He set his jaw. I'm not going to insult you by pretending I'm sorry I checked. In my world, checking is how I've stayed alive this long. But I am sorry I did it behind your back after you trusted me with something that cost you to say. That was cruelty, and it was cheap. And you didn't earn it. I'm sorry, Grace. It was, Grace would realize later, one of the most important things that ever happened in that house. Not because of the apology itself, though that was rare enough, but because in that moment, Adrian Moretti learned something that would change everything that came after. He learned that respect and terror could not live in the same room. That for 11 years he'd had Victor's fear and mistaken it for loyalty, had the whole house's fear and mistaken it for order. And here was one woman who did not fear him, who talked back to him, who told him the truth about himself. And the strange thing, the thing he could not stop turning over, was that her not fearing him made him trust her more, not less. He gave her a raise, a large one. And when she started to object, when she said she hadn't done anything worth that kind of money, he cut her off. This is not a reward for saving my life, he said, because you keep telling me you didn't save it, and I've decided to believe you. This is your salary for a real job I'm giving you as of today. Household Nutrition Coordinator. You'll work directly with Dr. Lawson. You'll have authority over what comes out of that kitchen and who eats it and when. You will not answer to a chef because there isn't going to be another chef. Do you understand? Grace understood, and she took the job, though not the way he thought. She took it because a community kitchen was starting to form in the back of her mind, though she did not know that yet, and because for the first time in 10 years, she had walked back into a kitchen and not fallen apart. And she started over the following weeks to eat at the table with him. It began as a practical thing. He would not eat with someone standing over him, and she would not let him eat alone and slip back into pushing food away, so she sat. And after a while, she started making a plate for herself too. She noticed something then that she hadn't noticed in years. She always made enough for 1.5 people. Not 1, not 2, 1.5. It was a habit from the end, from cooking for her mother. When her mother could only eat a little and Grace would eat the rest so the food wasn't wasted and so her mother wouldn't feel bad about how little she managed. 10 years, and her hand still measured out that extra half portion without asking her. Adrian noticed too, and without making anything of it, he started taking the extra half onto his own plate quietly, so the food that Grace's grief kept cooking would not sit there uneaten. Neither of them talked about it. It was just a thing that happened at the table, the extra half portion moving from her side to his, a small daily act of two broken people learning to share the weight of what they carried. It was not romance. Grace made sure of that in her own mind again and again. She was not drawn to his power. And God knew she'd seen enough of the world to know that his kind of power destroyed people. And Adrian, for his part, never once treated her kindness as something his money could buy. Never once looked at her the way rich men looked at women who worked for them. What grew between them was something harder to name and harder to break. It was trust built one spoonful at a time, between a man who had trusted no one in 20 years and a woman who had let no one close in 10. But peace, in that house, was never going to be allowed to last. Because across the city, Leonard Crowe had noticed too. Crowe had spent 5 careful months telling everyone who mattered that Adrian Moretti was a dead man. He had leaned close to Adrian's own associates in quiet rooms and murmured the poison. He's finished. He can't eat, he can't lead, he's wasting away. Stand with me now, and when he's gone, you'll be on the right side of it. He had planned it all out. When Adrian died or grew weak enough, Crowe would move on the businesses, absorb the territory, inherit an empire he had done nothing to build. And now Adrian Moretti was appearing in public again, walking steady, giving orders that stuck. Reclaiming ground Crowe had already counted as his own. It made Crowe furious, and it made him frightened. And frightened men asked questions. His people started asking around. Quietly at first, then less so. Who was the new woman at Ravenwood? What was she feeding him? Some maid, they said. Some nobody who walked in off the street, and now the boss can't eat a meal without her. Where does she go when she leaves the estate? What's her schedule? Who is she really? And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a grocery clerk who filled the standing order for Ravenwood pulled Helen aside when she came to settle the account and told her something that made her go cold. 2 men had come in the day before. Well-dressed, polite, wrong. They'd asked about the estate's orders, and then they'd offered him money, real money, for the delivery schedule, and for anything he knew about the woman who did the ordering now. He'd said no. He'd been afraid to say no and afraid to say yes, and he'd said no and sent them off. And then he'd worried about it all night, and now he was telling Helen because Helen had always been decent to him, and this felt like something she needed to know. Helen took it straight to Adrian, and Adrian, listening, felt the whole fragile thing he'd been building tip toward the edge because 2 men asking a grocery clerk about Grace's schedule meant only one thing. Crowe knew about her. Crowe had figured out that the maid was the reason his dead man had come back to life. And in Crowe's world, when something was keeping your enemy alive, you did not ask polite questions forever. Eventually, you moved on it. There was something else, too, buried in it, that made Adrian's blood run cold. The strangers hadn't just been guessing. They'd known the delivery schedule existed. They'd known Grace did the ordering now. That was recent information. That was inside information. Someone at Ravenwood was talking to Crowe. Adrian gave the order before he'd fully thought it through. Close the gates, nobody in or out without his say. And Grace, he said, Grace does not leave the estate. Not for anything. Not until this is handled. He thought he was protecting her. He was so certain he was protecting her that it did not occur to him until he saw her face that he had just done to Grace exactly the thing he had learned not to do. He had taken away her choice. You're telling me I can't leave, Grace said. I'm telling you it isn't safe. I came here to work, she said, and her voice was rising, and the fear underneath it was real. I took a maid's job. I did not agree to be locked behind a set of gates. I did not agree to become a piece on your board, sir. There are men out there asking about me because of you, because of your war, and now I can't walk out the front gate? Grace, if they take you, they will use you against me, and they will not be gentle about it. Do you understand what these people are? I am keeping you alive. You're keeping me caged. Grace shot back, and the word landed like a slap. You know how I know the difference? Because when you keep someone alive, they still get to choose things. When you cage them, they don't. She was shaking now and not backing down. If you protect people by taking away every choice they have, then you're not protecting them, sir. You're controlling them. And I have spent my whole life around people who couldn't tell those two things apart. And I promised myself I would never work for one of them again. The words hit Adrian harder than any threat Crowe could have sent, because they were the same words underneath that she'd said to him about the file. You had the right to protect yourself. You didn't have the right to take my choice. Twice now she had held up a mirror and made him look at the exact place where his instinct to protect curdled into his instinct to control. And twice she'd been right, and he was starting to understand that these were not 2 different failings. They were the same one. It was the thing at the root of his whole life. He protected the people he cared about by owning them. He had done it to everyone. He had never once managed to keep someone safe without taking them prisoner. He did not answer her with the language of command that time. He went to her. That evening, after the house had quieted, Adrian walked out to the small apartment above the garage where Grace stayed, and he did not walk in the way he walked into every other room in that estate, like he owned it, which he did. He stopped at her door, and he knocked. Grace opened it wary, red-eyed, ready for another fight. I'm not coming in, Adrian said. I came to say two things and then I'll leave you be. He took a breath. The first is that I'm sorry. Again, you'd think I'd learn faster. I did the same thing to you tonight I did with that file. I decided what was best for you and I took away your say in it, and I called it protection, and you were right to be furious. He shook his head. The second thing is a real choice, an actual one. There are men who owe me favors in places that matter. I can have you placed under federal protection tonight, out of this house and out of Crowe's reach, given a new start somewhere, far from all of this. And you'd never have to see me or Ravenwood again. That's on the table. It's a real door, and it's open. Or you stay, Adrian said, with everything on the table. No pretending it's safe. You'd know exactly how dangerous Crowe is, exactly what he might do. And you'd choose it with your eyes open instead of me choosing it for you. But I will not lie to you to keep you here. And I will not chain you here to keep you alive. If you stay because you decided to. He met her eyes. That's the difference between the two things you were talking about. I finally heard you. It was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere below, an engine idled and went still. Why do you even want me to stay, Grace said. You know it's a risk to you. You know Crowe found me because of you. If I go into protection, your soft spot walks out the gate and he's got nothing to grab. It'd be smarter to send me away. It would, Adrian agreed. So why? Adrian was quiet. And then he told her the truth, which was becoming a habit around this woman that he could not seem to break. Because 11 days ago I had already decided to die, he said. And you didn't argue me out of it, and you didn't cure me. You just kept setting down a small spoon in front of a man too scared to eat. And you let me find my own way back to wanting to live. Nobody's done anything like that for me since my mother. He paused. I'm not asking you to stay for my sake. I'm telling you I'd rather have you alive and far away and free than here and in danger. But you asked why I want it. That's why. Grace looked at him for a long time. I'll stay, she said finally. For now, not because you asked. Because there are things I started here that I'm not finished with. She lifted her chin. But I stay on one condition, and I mean it, sir. Whatever you do about Crowe, whatever happens, there is no killing done in my name. You do not go out there and hurt people and tell yourself it's because they came after me. You do not put my name on anyone's death. If I'm the reason a man dies, then I might as well have never made my mother that promise at all. Do you understand my name? Adrian was quiet. And here was the moment Grace did not fully see, though some part of her must have sensed it, because she watched his face while she waited for his answer. Adrian Moretti had lived his whole life by one law, which was that when someone threatened what was his, that someone stopped being a problem. It was who he was. It was how he had survived. And she was asking him to promise the one thing that went against every instinct he owned. I promise, Adrian said. He said it looking her in the eye, and he meant it. And as the words left his mouth, he understood, with a cold clarity that turned his stomach in a way the ulcer never had, that he was not at all sure he could keep it. Because he did not yet know what Crowe was planning. He did not know that within days he would learn there was a traitor sitting at his own table, a man he trusted, feeding his secrets to the enemy under a threat of his own. He did not know that a bottle would be placed in Grace's kitchen designed to make her look like a killer. He did not know that Crowe intended to poison him at his own dinner table and hang it around the neck of the one person in that house who had reminded him how to live. He knew none of that yet. He only knew that he had just promised a grieving woman that no one would die in her name, and that everything in his blood and his history and the world he had built told him it was a promise he had no way to keep. And Grace, watching his face, saw the promise and saw the doubt underneath it, and understood that she had asked a wolf to swear off the hunt, and that the days ahead would test whether a man could truly become someone new, or whether change was just a story frightened people told themselves at the dinner table before the world reminded them who they'd always been. Victor Hale found the traitor on a Thursday, and when he brought Adrian the name, Adrian did not believe it at first. Say it again, Adrian said. Thomas Avery. No. Sir, Thomas has kept my books for 9 years. He was at my mother's funeral, Victor. He held my daughter when she was christened before her mother took her away from me. Thomas Avery does not sell me to Leonard Crowe. Victor said nothing. He just set down the evidence on the desk, phone records as the wire transfers, the small, careful trail of a man who had been feeding information out of Ravenwood for 2 months, the delivery schedule, Grace's routine, Adrian's medication times, the recovery, meal by meal, reported to the enemy. Adrian looked at it for a long time and felt something old and cold rise up in him, the thing that had made him feared, the thing that in the old days would have already decided how Thomas Avery was going to die. Bring him to me, Adrian said quietly, and Victor. Not a word to Grace. But Grace found out anyway, because Grace found out most things in that house now. And when she did it, she came to Adrian's study and shut the door behind her. You're going to hurt Thomas. Grace, this doesn't concern. He sat next to me at the staff table. My second week here, Grace said. He showed me pictures of his daughter. He's asked me to save him a plate when he worked late. A man doesn't do that if he's cold enough to sell you to somebody who wants you dead. Something's wrong with this. Something made him do it. She stepped closer to the desk. You promised me. Nothing in my name, and I'm telling you, before you do a single thing to that man, you find out why. Because if you punish somebody who was forced into this and call it protecting me, then you've broken your promise, and you don't even know it. Adrian looked at her. The old Adrian would have had Thomas taken care of before the sun set and never thought about it again. That was the whole trouble. He could feel the old Adrian right there under his skin, wanting to move. All right, he said, I'll ask him first. He questioned Thomas Avery himself, alone in the study, and he did not raise a hand, and he did not raise his voice, which frightened Thomas more than shouting would have, because Thomas knew exactly what Adrian Moretti was capable of. How long, Adrian said. Thomas broke almost at once. He was not a hard man. He was an accountant who had made the mistake of being useful to a monster, and the whole story came pouring out of him in pieces, his hands shaking, his voice cracking. Crowe had his daughter. Not literally, not yet. But Crowe's men had made themselves known to her. They had shown up where she worked. They had told her father, in careful terms, that a young woman could have an accident, that a young woman could disappear, that a young woman's safety was a fragile thing, that depended entirely on how helpful her father chose to be. And Thomas Avery, who had no army and no power, and no way to protect the only person in the world he loved, had done the only thing he could think of to keep her breathing. He had talked. I'm sorry, Thomas wept. I'm so sorry, Adrian, I didn't want to. They showed me a photograph of her leaving her apartment. They knew her whole schedule. What was I supposed to do? She's all I've got. She's all I've got left in the world. Adrian sat very still and listened to a man describe being forced to betray in order to protect someone he loved, and he heard underneath it the exact thing he had been wrestling with for weeks, the line between protecting someone and losing yourself to fear over them. Thomas had crossed it. Thomas had done a terrible thing out of love, and Adrian, who had done terrible things out of love his whole life and called it strength, could not pretend he didn't understand. The old Adrian wanted Thomas gone anyway. A traitor was a traitor. The man Grace was slowly pulling out of him made a different choice. Here's what's going to happen, Adrian said. I am going to protect your daughter. Tonight. I have people who can put her somewhere. Crowe will never reach her, and I'll do it whether you help me or not, because no man should have to choose between his child and his conscience. And I won't leave her out there as a knife against your throat. He leaned forward. But in exchange, you are going to give me everything. Every piece of information Crowe fed you, every man who contacted you, every instruction they gave. You're going to help me end him. Not with violence, with the truth. Can you do that? Thomas Avery wept and said yes. And what Thomas gave him turned Adrian's blood to ice. Because Crowe was not planning to wait for Adrian to weaken again. Crowe had learned that Adrian was recovering, that the maid's cooking had brought him back, and Crowe had decided to turn that recovery into a weapon. The plan was simple and it was vicious. Crowe intended to poison Adrian at a private dinner, and he intended to make it look like the food had done it. He intended for Adrian Moretti to sicken and collapse and possibly die at his own table, and for every man in that organization to look at the woman who had been cooking every bite Adrian ate for weeks and reach the obvious conclusion. Grace would take the blame. Grace, who had brought him back from the dead. The story would write itself. She got close to him. She gained his trust. She poisoned him. Crowe would step into the vacuum. The loyal ones would scatter. And the maid who had reminded a monster how to live would go down as his murderer. And the worst of it, the detail that made Adrian stand up so fast his chair went over, was this. The poison was already in the house. A bottle of imported oil. Expensive, the kind that would look right at home in a wealthy man's kitchen, delivered through a supplier Crowe had gotten to, sitting somewhere among Grace's things right now, waiting to be used, waiting to make her a killer. Adrian went to the kitchen himself, and he did not tell Grace why at first. He went through the shelves, the pantry, the cold storage, moving fast, and Grace watched him with growing alarm. What are you looking for? A bottle of oil, sealed, something you didn't buy. Grace went pale. There's a bottle that came in with the specialty order last week. I didn't order it. I figured Helen did or you did. It's right. She reached for a shelf. Don't touch it. Adrian said, sharp enough that she froze. He took it down himself, carefully, and held it up to the light. And there it was. The thing that made it real. The thing that turned a story into a fact. The seal. The factory seal on the cap had been broken and re-glued. Cleanly, expertly, but not perfectly. Someone had opened this bottle, put something in it, and sealed it again to look untouched. Grace stared at it. Then she stared at Adrian. And Adrian watched the understanding hit her, watched her realize that if that oil had gone into a dish, if Adrian had gotten sick or died, every finger in that house would have pointed at the woman who cooked it. They were going to make it me, she whispered. Yes, with my own hands. Not even knowing. Her voice shook. I would have made your last meal and it would have killed you, and I never would have understood why. But you didn't, Adrian said. And you're not going to, because we found it. Victor Hale wanted blood. Victor had wanted blood since the moment he learned the name Leonard Crowe, and now that he understood the full shape of the plan, the poison, the frame, the plot to turn Grace into a murderer, he could barely hold himself still. Give me the word, Victor said. Give me the word, and Crowe is a memory by morning. We know where he sleeps. This ends tonight the clean way, before he ever gets the chance. And Adrian felt it, the pull, stronger than it had been in months. Every instinct he owned agreed with Victor. A man had tried to poison him. A man had tried to hang it on the one person who'd saved his life. In the world Adrian came from, there was only one answer to that, and it was the answer Victor was begging to carry out. He almost gave the word. He felt it rise in his throat. And then he thought about Grace standing in that garage doorway, asking him to promise. Nothing in my name. And he thought about what Crowe wanted, what Crowe was counting on, and he saw the trap inside the trap. No, Adrian said. Victor stared at him. No? If I kill him, I prove him right. Adrian set the poison bottle down on the counter gently. Think about it, Victor. Crowe has spent 5 months telling everyone, I'm just a brute who solves everything with violence. If I send men to his house in the night, I'm exactly the animal he's been describing, and more than tightened. I made a promise, and I have spent my whole life breaking promises the second they got inconvenient, and telling myself that was strength. I'm done doing that. There's another way to end a man, and it takes more than a gun. He looked at the bottle. I'm going to invite him to dinner. The plan took shape over the next 2 days, and it nearly broke Grace's trust before it began, because when Adrian told her he was going to invite Leonard Crowe into Ravenwood, into her kitchen, and have her cook the dinner, she thought for one terrible moment that he had lost his mind. You want me to cook for the man who was going to frame me for murder. I want you to cook the most honest meal you've ever made, Adrian said. Broth, bread, simple pasta, parsley, the food that brought me back. I want him to sit at my table and smell exactly what saved my life. And I want him to understand, before I say a single word, that the thing he tried to use as a weapon is the thing that beat him. He held her eyes. But I'm not going to lie to you about the danger. He's a snake, and snakes are most dangerous when they're cornered. If you don't want any part of this, you say so, and I'll find another way. Your choice, a real one. He had learned. She could see that he had learned. He was handing her the choice instead of taking it, the way he'd sworn he would. I'll do it, Grace said. Name it. Before that man ever sets foot in this house, the evidence goes out. All of it. Thomas's records, the poisoned bottle, everything Crowe's done. It goes to people who can actually use it. Dr. Lawson's got a lawyer she trusts, and that lawyer has contacts in law enforcement who are clean. Copies go to them first, sealed, ready to open the second anything happens to you or me. I am not sitting in a room with a killer on nothing but your promise not to lose your temper. If this is going to be done with the truth, then the truth leaves this house before he arrives, and it's already in safe hands where he can't touch it. Adrian did not like it. She watched him not like it. Handing that much evidence to outside people, to lawyers and the law, went against 20 years of keeping everything inside the family, controlling every card. It was a loss of control that made his skin crawl. All right, he said. And she understood, watching him agree to the thing that cost him most, that he had changed more than she'd let herself believe. The dinner was set for Sunday evening. Leonard Crowe accepted the invitation with the smug confidence of a man who thought he was walking in to collect. Adrian had sent word that he wanted to discuss a peaceful transfer of power, that he was tired, that his health was uncertain, and he wanted to arrange his affairs before things got worse. It was exactly what Crowe wanted to hear. It fit the story Crowe had been telling for 5 months. He came expecting to find a dying man ready to hand over a kingdom. He walked in at 7 o'clock, and Adrian was waiting for him, and the first thing that went wrong for Leonard Crowe, though he didn't know it yet, was that Adrian Moretti did not look like a dying man. The second thing that went wrong was where Adrian sat him. Crowe took his chair at the long table and settled in, and only after he was seated did he glance up, and there, above the head of the table, hung the portrait of a woman, Adrian's mother. She had watched over that dining room for 10 years, and Adrian had arranged it so that Leonard Crowe would sit directly beneath her gaze the entire evening, though Crowe had no idea why, and it made him vaguely uncomfortable without his knowing the reason. And then the smell reached him. Not the smell of a rich man's kitchen. Chicken broth, fresh bread parsley, simple pasta. The plain, clean, unmistakable smell of a sick room, of a mother's kitchen, of food made for the hurting. Crowe wrinkled his nose. He had come expecting a feast, some grand last supper from a man trying to buy goodwill. Instead, the whole house smelled like a hospital and a home at the same time. And he did not understand it, and not understanding it made him uneasy. Odd choice of menu, Crowe said as Grace and Helen brought the dishes out. He looked at Grace as she set down a bowl, and Adrian watched the calculation move behind his eyes, and understood that Crowe was looking at the woman he'd planned to frame and enjoying it. Broth for a man of your means? I'd have expected better, Adrian. Then again, they tell me you've had trouble keeping food down. I've had a lot of trouble keeping things down lately, Adrian said pleasantly. Food. Traitors. Men who thought I was already in the ground. He let that sit for exactly one beat. But my appetite's come back. All of it. Something flickered in Crowe's face. He covered it with a smile. They ate. Or Crowe ate, and Adrian watched, taking small, careful spoonfuls of broth with the little teaspoon that sat not beside his bowl, the same little spoon that had started all of this. And every time he lifted it, Crowe's eyes went to it. And something about that small, ordinary spoon in the hand of a man he'd been told was dying seemed to unnerve Crowe more and more as the meal went on. Finally, Adrian set the spoon down. I want to show you something, Adrian said. He reached down beside his chair and lifted up a bottle and set it on the table, in the middle, between the two of them. A bottle of imported oil, sealed, unopened. And Leonard Crowe looked at it, and every drop of color drained out of his face, because he knew that bottle. He had arranged for that bottle. That bottle was supposed to be in a dish right now, working its way through Adrian's system. And instead, it was sitting on the table in front of him, whole and untouched, its broken seal facing up where anyone could see it. The room went very quiet. You recognize it, Adrian said. It was not a question. I don't know what that is, Crowe said, but his voice had lost its ease. Sure you do. You had it delivered through the Panetta supply line, which you got to about 3 months ago. Somebody opened it, put enough poison in it to put a healthy man in the ground, and resealed it so it'd look factory fresh. The plan was for it to end up in my dinner, for me to sicken and collapse and maybe die at this table, and for every man who works for me to look at the woman who cooked my meals for the last 6 weeks. Adrian nodded toward the kitchen door, where Grace stood beside Helen, and Crowe's eyes followed. And decide she did it. Crowe said nothing. I have the records, Adrian went on, his voice level. The transfers. The supplier. Testimony from the man you threatened into feeding you information, whose daughter, by the way, is somewhere you'll never find her. So that lever's gone. I have all of it. And so do several people outside this house who have never taken a dollar from me and who will open sealed envelopes the moment anything happens to me or to anyone in my staff. It's already out, Leonard. It left this house before you walked in. There's no version of tonight where you get clean. And Leonard Crowe, cornered, did the thing that cornered men do. He stopped pretending and he went for the throat. He laughed. Look at you, Crowe said. Look at what you've become. Adrian Moretti, the man who used to make grown men wet themselves, and now what? You eat baby food out of a little spoon. You let a cleaning woman run your kitchen. You've got the law on speed dial like some frightened citizen. You didn't get sick, Adrian. You got weak. A maid fed you soup and you turned into a coward. Your father would be ashamed of what's sitting in his chair. And there it was. The provocation. Crowe was doing it on purpose. Adrian understood that even through the heat that flashed up his spine, Crowe was trying to make him angry, trying to make him lash out. Because a violent Adrian was the Adrian Crowe could still win against. The Adrian who proved every ugly story true. Victor stood against the wall, coiled, waiting for the signal. One word from Adrian and Crowe would never leave that room. You want to talk about my mother? Crowe pushed, watching the portrait, watching Adrian's face. That's her up there, isn't it? The dead woman you're so sentimental about. I heard she died screaming, couldn't keep so much as water down, and here you are recreating her deathbed at your dinner table like a... Careful, Victor said low. And that one. Crowe jerked his chin toward Grace in the doorway. When I'm done with you, Adrian, I'll make sure she might. For several seconds, the man Adrian used to be nearly won. Everyone in that room felt it. Adrian's hand had gone flat on the table. His jaw was iron. The old cold thing was fully awake in him now, roaring, and Victor's eyes were fixed on him, waiting for the smallest nod, and Leonard Crowe had just threatened his mother's memory, and the woman who saved his life in the same breath. And there was a version of Adrian Moretti, a version that had existed for 20 years, that would have ended this with a single gesture and slept fine afterward. And then quietly Grace crossed the room. She did not say a word. She came to the head of the table, and she picked up the little teaspoon that lay beside Adrian's bowl, and she set it down again gently, right beside his hand, where he could see it. The small spoon. The spoon that feels like a choice instead of a demand. The spoon that had started as proof of the worst version of him being too afraid to eat, and had become, somewhere along the way, the thing that reminded him he could be someone else. Adrian looked at the spoon, and he remembered his promise. Nothing in my name. He remembered that this was the whole test, the only test that ever mattered, whether change was real or whether it was just a story he told himself at the table before the world, reminded him who he'd always been. He remembered that Crowe wanted this, was begging for it, had built his entire play around the certainty that underneath the recovery, Adrian was still just an animal that killed when it was cornered. Adrian took his hand off the table. No, he said. Victor blinked. Sir, stand down, Victor. Nobody dies tonight. Adrian looked at Crowe, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and almost gentle, which was somehow more terrible than rage. You came here thinking you'd find a dead man or a brute, and you thought if it was a brute, you could beat him. Because a brute always does the predictable thing. He kills you, and then he's a murderer, and your people rally, and the story you've been telling for 5 months comes true. He shook his head slowly. You spent all that effort figuring out how to poison me, Leonard, and you never once figured out that the maid didn't teach me to eat soup. She reminded me that strength without humanity is just fear wearing an expensive suit. That's what you are. You're the most frightened man I've ever met. You're so scared of being weak you'd murder a woman to look strong. I know what that is, I used to be it. Crowe's face twisted. You're a coward, maybe. Adrian slid a folder across the table. Here's your choice, and it's a real one, which is more than you were going to give me. You sign over the legitimate businesses you've been trying to steal tonight in front of witnesses. And then you leave New York, permanently, and you cooperate with the federal investigators who are going to be very interested in what those sealed envelopes contain. Or you don't, and you walk out of here a free man tonight, and you spend the rest of your life running from every piece of evidence I just described, in open court with no protection from me at all. He leaned back. One of those roads, you get to keep breathing without looking over your shoulder every second. The other one, the truth follows you until it catches you. Your choice. You're letting me walk, Crowe said, incredulous. You had me. You could end me right here, and you're letting me walk out that door? That's not mercy, Adrian. That's weakness. That's you being too soft to do what needs. Killing, you would take one command, Adrian said. I could say the word right now, and it'd be done in a minute, and I wouldn't lose an hour of sleep. That's easy. That's the coward's way, and I've taken it my whole life. Letting the truth follow you for the rest of your life. Letting you sit in a courtroom and answer for what you did. Letting the law do to you what a bullet would do, faster and cleaner. That takes more courage than putting you in the ground. It means I have to trust something bigger than my own hands. I never used to be able to do that. He stood, sign or don't. But you're going to do it under supervision either way, because you're not leaving this estate alone. Leonard Crowe looked around the room at Victor, at the sealed evidence he now understood had already escaped him, at the portrait of the woman above his head, at the maid standing in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands who had somehow beaten him without ever raising her voice, and the confidence drained out of him completely, and he understood that he had already lost, that he had lost the moment. He decided a man who ate soup from a small spoon was weak. He signed. Crowe left Ravenwood that night under Victor's supervision, escorted out, and the sealed evidence went to the people Grace had insisted receive it. And over the following weeks, Leonard Crowe's network did not fall to a war. It fell to arrests, to financial seizures, to subpoenas and testimony and the slow grinding weight of a truth that could not be outrun. No bodies, no headlines about a gangland killing. Just a man swallowed by the consequences of his own choices, exactly the way Adrian had said, and it was in the end a far more complete ending than any bullet would have given him. But the real climax of that night did not happen at the table with Crowe. It happened after. Because when Crowe was gone and the house was quiet and the danger had passed, Adrian Moretti walked back into the dining room and sat down at his place, and he could not eat. His hands were trembling. Not from the ulcer, not from illness, from the thing he had almost done, from how close it had been, how badly he had wanted to give Victor the nod, how the old animal had risen up in him fully awake, and it had taken a small spoon set beside his hand to stop it. He sat there shaking, and he understood that he had not become a new man tonight. He had only, for one evening, chosen to act like one, and it had nearly not been enough. Grace came in and sat down across from him. She did not tell him he'd done great. She did not tell him it was over, that everything was fine now, that he was a good man. She had spent too long around the truth to lie to comfort someone. Instead, she reached for the bowl, and she filled the little teaspoon with broth, and she set it down within his reach, right where he could pick it up himself. "You made one different choice tonight," Grace said quietly. That's all it was. One choice, the right way one time. It doesn't make you finished, and it doesn't make you clean, and it doesn't erase anything you did before I got here. She looked at him steadily, and there was no cruelty in it, and no false comfort either, just the plain truth her mother had taught her to carry. But you made it. And tomorrow you're going to wake up, and you're going to have to make another one just as hard. And the day after that, another. That's what it is. It's not one night. It's every morning for the rest of your life. She nudged the spoon a half-inch closer. So eat something. You've got a lot of mornings ahead of you. Adrian looked at the little spoon. His hands were still shaking. And then slowly, he reached out, and he picked it up himself, and he lifted it to his mouth, and he ate. The morning after Crowe left Ravenwood, Adrian made the first of the harder choices Grace had warned him about, and it had nothing to do with Crowe at all. It had to do with Thomas Avery. Victor came to him early, before the house was fully awake, and Victor's face said the thing before his mouth did. "The men are talking, sir, about Thomas. They know he sold you out to Crowe. They know his information almost got you killed." Victor hesitated. "They're waiting to see what you do about it. And I'll be honest with you, most of them think there's only one right answer." "And what do you think, Victor?" Victor was quiet a moment. 11 years he'd worked for Adrian Moretti. In 11 years he'd never once been asked what he thought about anything. "I think a man who betrays you deserves what betrayal earns," Victor said slowly. "That's what I was taught. That's what you taught me." He looked at his boss. "But I stood in that dining room last night, sir, and I watched you not kill Crowe when every part of you wanted to. So I don't know anymore. I'm asking you what the rule is, because I think the rule changed and nobody told me." It was the most honest thing Victor Hale had ever said to him, and Adrian understood in that moment that his recovery had never been only about his own stomach. The whole house was sick with the same thing he'd been sick with. Fear mistaken for order, cruelty mistaken for strength. And they were all watching now, every man of them, to see whether the change in Adrian was real, or whether it had been a performance for one night in front of an enemy. "Bring Thomas to me," Adrian said, "and bring the men, the ones who want to see what I do. Let them watch." They gathered in the study, a dozen hard men who had all, at one time or another, made someone disappear on Adrian's word. And Thomas Avery was brought in among them, gray-faced, certain he was about to die, because he knew the rule as well as any of them. "Thomas Avery fed information to Leonard Crowe for 2 months, Adrian said, and he said it to the room, not to Thomas. The deliberation times, my recovery, meal by meal. That information was going to be used to poison me at my own table and blame it on an innocent woman. Every one of you knows what that earns in this house." The men waited. Thomas closed his eyes. "Crowe threatened his daughter," Adrian went on. "Showed him a photograph of her leaving her apartment. Made it clear she could have an accident. And Thomas, who has no army and no power and no way on this earth to protect her, did the only thing he could think of to keep her alive. He talked." Adrian looked around the room. "Now, I want each of you to ask yourselves something. If a man put a photograph of your child in front of you and told you what he'd do to her, and the only thing standing between her and that was a piece of information, how many of you are so sure you'd have done different?" Nobody answered, because every one of them, underneath the hardness, had someone. "I am not going to kill Thomas Avery," Adrian said. "I'm not going to hurt him, and I'm not going to let any of you hurt him either. He did a terrible thing out of love, and I have done terrible things out of love my whole life and called it strength. And I am done pretending those are different." He turned to Thomas. "You're off the books. You'll never touch my finances again. Because trust like that, once it's broken, doesn't come back all the way, and we both know it. But your daughter is safe, and I'm going to fund your family's relocation somewhere clean and far from all of this. And you're going to testify to what Crowe did, and then you're going to go live the rest of your life. That's the sentence. Mercy and the truth. Not because you earned mercy, because I'm choosing to be the kind of man who gives it. Thomas Avery wept openly, and some of the hard men in the room shifted, uncomfortable, and a few of them Adrian saw, looked at him with something they had never shown him before, not fear, respect. And a few others looked at him with the opposite, with a wariness that said they thought their leader had gone soft. And Adrian marked those faces, because he understood that this choice was going to cost him. It did. Over the following weeks, the opposition inside his own organization made itself known. Not openly, not at first. It came as grumbling, as meetings Adrian wasn't told about. As senior men, men who had prospered under the old rules, quietly questioning whether a boss who spared traitors and refused to answer poison with blood was a boss worth following. Mercy will make him look weak, they said among themselves. Weak men get eaten. And if he's not going to protect this organization the way it needs protecting, maybe somebody else should. Victor brought him each piece of it, loyal, worried. You're making enemies inside your own house now, sir. It's not Crowe anymore, it's your own people. Some of them think you've lost your nerve. Some of them are starting to wonder out loud whether it's time for new leadership. He paused. I can handle it the old way if you want. Quiet, clean, before it grows. And there it was again. The old answer sitting right there, easy as ever. Adrian could crush the dissent the way he'd crushed dissent for 20 years. And it would work. It always worked. And he would keep his empire and his power and his name. But something had shifted in him that he could no longer unshift. And it forced him to finally look at the thing at the center of his whole life, the contradiction he had spent decades refusing to see. He wanted peace inside his own home. He wanted a table where the staff sat instead of standing against the walls. He wanted to eat a meal without a fist in his stomach. He wanted the quiet, careful trust he had with Grace to be the temperature of his whole life. And he had built every dollar of his power on the exact opposite, on fear, on the certainty that the people around him would obey because the alternative was too terrible. He wanted to be safe inside his house and feared outside it, and he finally understood, sitting in his study while Victor waited for an answer, that those two things could not exist in the same man. The fear he needed outside would always leak back in. It had leaked in as Thomas's betrayal. It had leaked in as Crowe's poison. It would leak in forever, as long as he kept feeding it. Because you cannot build a wall of terror and then be surprised when your own house stands inside the wall. No, Adrian said, we're not handling it the old way. Not this, not anything anymore. Victor stared at him. Then what do? We stop, Adrian said. We start taking the whole thing apart. And that was the twist that nobody in that house saw coming, least of all the men who thought Adrian had merely gone soft. He had not gone soft. He had gone somewhere far more dangerous to them. He had decided to end it. He brought in the lawyer, the clean one, Doctor. Lawson trusted, the one who already held the sealed evidence against Crowe. And he began the long, painful, deliberate work of pulling his life apart. He started separating the legitimate holdings from the criminal ones, the real businesses from the ones that were fronts, the money that was clean from the money that had blood on it. And where he found rot, he did not hide it. He began carefully with counsel to provide evidence against the partners and operations involved in the worst of it. The trafficking, the extortion, the corruption that reached into places it should never have reached. He understood exactly what he was doing. He was not just walking away. A man in his position did not simply retire. Cooperating meant that eventually the truth would come for him too. It might cost him his wealth. It might cost him his freedom. It would certainly cost him the empire and the name, and the fear that had defined him for his entire adult life. You understand what this does to you, the lawyer said, more than once, laying it out plainly because it was his job to. You're not just dismantling Crowe's world. You're dismantling your own. There is a real chance this ends with you in a courtroom, Mr. Moretti. There is a real chance it ends with you in a cell. I understand, Adrian said. He told Grace about it one evening over dinner, the extra half portion moving from her plate to his the way it always did now. I need you to know what I'm doing, he said, because it might end badly for me, and you deserve to decide what you want to do about that before it happens instead of after, he told her. All of it, the dismantling, the cooperation, the real possibility of prison at the end of it. Grace listened, and she did not look shocked, and she did not tell him he was brave or foolish. She just set down her fork. Why, she said. Not the version you'd tell a lawyer. The real one. Why are you doing this? Adrian was quiet a long time. Because my mother is up there on that wall, he said finally. And I spent 10 years telling myself I became who I became to honor her, to make sure no one could ever take anything from us again the way the cancer took her. That's the lie I lived on. And then you walked in and made me a bowl of soup that smelled like her kitchen, and I had to sit with the truth, which is that she would be ashamed of me. Everything I built, she'd be ashamed of. I took her death, and I turned it into an excuse to become a man who hurt people. His voice was rough. I can't give her back her life. I can't undo one thing I've done, but I can stop. I can quit adding to the pile. And maybe if I take the whole thing apart honestly, that's something closer to the son she raised than the empire I built pretending to honor her. Grace reached across the table and put her hand over his, which she had never done before, and neither of them made it into more than what it was, which was one person telling another that they were not alone in the hardest thing they'd ever done. She'd be proud of the stopping, Grace said quietly. My mother taught me that. You don't get proud of people for never falling. You get proud of them for what they do after they've fallen as far as a person can fall. The getting up is the whole thing. She squeezed his hand and let go. Now finish your food. You've got a long road. He did the work. Over months, he closed the predatory businesses, the ones that trapped people in debts they could never repay, and he released the workers from those debts, actually released them, tore up the paper, which cost him more money than most men would ever see, and which he did without blinking. He stopped funding the operations he could not defend. And he kept talking to the lawyer, kept building the case that would eventually turn on him too, kept choosing, morning after morning, exactly the way Grace had said he'd have to. One choice the right way one day, and then another, and then another. And Grace, watching him do it, finally made a choice of her own that she'd been circling for weeks. Adrian had tried more than once to reward her. Properly, extravagantly. He had offered her money, a house, security for the rest of her life, and every time she'd said no, and he'd never understood why, until the evening she finally told him what she actually wanted. There is one thing, Grace said, but it's not for me. Not the way you mean. Anything. Don't say that until you've heard it. She took a breath. I want you to fund a community kitchen. A real one, legal, above the board, with no connection to your name or your money's history, clean from the first dollar. And I want it to make meals for people going through cancer treatment and deliver them to the people who are exactly where you were the night I met you and where my mother spent 30 years. Folks who've forgotten that life is still waiting for them because they're too sick and too scared to eat. Her voice caught. I wanted to do what my mother did, what I promised her I'd do. I want to finally keep the promise, and I want it to outlive both of us, and I want it to have absolutely nothing to do with the mafia or the money or any of it. Just food given gently to people who are hurting. Adrian looked at her, and for a moment he could not speak. What would you call it, he said finally. Lillian's table, Grace said, after my mother, and so it was built. Lillian's table. Funded quietly, structured cleanly, kept entirely separate from the wreckage of Adrian's old world. A legal and independent thing that would stand on its own long after everything else had fallen. And the strange, beautiful thing about it, how the broken people of Ravenwood gathered around it and were mended by the building of it. Helen retired from the estate and became the household services director of Lillian's Table, because after 15 years of serving a table where people stood against the walls in fear, she wanted to spend whatever years she had left, serving tables where people were fed out of love. Dr. Rebecca Lawson built the nutrition program, designing every meal to be gentle on bodies wrecked by chemotherapy, exactly the way she designed Adrian's meals to be gentle on his ruined stomach. And Thomas Avery's daughter, the young woman Crowe had threatened, who turned out to be an accountant, came and set up the finances, transparent to the penny, so that the thing that had nearly gotten her killed became the thing she helped keep honest. Adrian, meanwhile, did the hardest interior work of all, the work that had nothing to do with lawyers or businesses or empires. He went to therapy. It was, in its own way, as unlikely as anything else that had happened, the most feared man in that city, sitting in a quiet office once a week, talking to a professional about a grief he had carried for 10 years and never once snet down. He talked about his mother. He talked about the helplessness of watching her die when all his money could do nothing. He talked, eventually, about the thing underneath everything, which was that somewhere in that helplessness he had made a terrible private decision that if he could just become powerful enough, become feared enough, become untouchable enough, then he would never have to feel that helpless again. He had confused being feared with being safe. He had spent 20 years building fear, because fear felt like control, and control felt like the opposite of standing beside a hospital bed, unable to save the person you loved most. I thought if nobody could ever hurt me, he told the therapist, then I'd finally be safe. And I made a lot of people afraid to make that true, and I was never safe. Not one single day. I was just alone at the top of a pile of things I'd broken. And then one afternoon, he did the thing he had not been able to do in 10 years. He visited his mother's grave without bodyguards. That was the part that mattered, the part that made Victor argue with him, because Adrian Moretti did not go anywhere without protection. Had not in 20 years, could not, it wasn't safe. And Adrian had said quietly that he was tired of confusing safe with feared, and that a man could not stand at his mother's grave, surrounded by armed men, and honestly say he was becoming someone new. He went alone. He stood there a long time, and he said out loud to the stone the thing he had spent a decade unable to say. I'm sorry, Mom. I told myself I did it for you. I didn't. I did it because I was scared, and I dressed up my fear as strength, and I hurt people you would have fed. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I can't fix it, but I stopped. I finally stopped. And there's a woman named Grace. Her mother was like you, and we're making something that would have made you proud. It's got your kind of heart in it. I wanted you to know that the son you raised is still in here somewhere. He got lost for a long time, but he's coming back. His health, through all of it, kept improving. And the story of that healing was never once allowed to become a fairy tale, because Grace would not permit it, and neither, in the end, would Adrian. It was not the soup that healed him. It was not love, and it was not Grace's kindness alone, though those had opened the door. It was that he took the medication Dr. Lawson prescribed every dose. It was that he rested. It was that he ate on, stopped drinking and cut the coffee, and above all, that he began painfully to drain the ocean of stress that had been pouring acid into an open wound in his body for years. The stress of a life built on fear, the stress of always waiting for the knife. The food had reminded him that life was still waiting. But he had to choose the medicine, and the therapy, and the honesty, and the long, slow dismantling, and he chose them, one hard morning at a time, and his body healed, because he finally gave it a reason and a chance to. And at Ravenwood, the last thing to change was the dining room itself. For years it had been a place of fear, a long table where Adrian sat at the head and the staff stood pressed against the walls, silent, waiting to be needed, terrified to be noticed. And slowly over those months, that changed too. It started small. A staff member lingering instead of retreating. Adrian asking a question and actually waiting for the answer. And then one evening, Adrian asked one of the kitchen girls to sit down and eat with them instead of standing, and she looked at him like she'd misheard, and then she sat. And the world did not end. He began to learn their names. All of them. He learned who had children and how many, who was putting a brother through school, who had been at Ravenwood for a decade, and had never once been asked a single thing about their own life. He had employed some of these people for years and had never known them, had walked past them the way a man walks past furniture, and now he learned them, one by one, and it shamed him, and he did it anyway. Because the shame was the point. The shame was the door back to being human. And then came the Sunday that Helen would remember for the rest of her life. It was one of her last Sundays before she left to run Lillian's table full-time. The household had gathered for a meal, the new kind of meal, the kind where people sat. And Adrian stood at the head of the table, near the chair that had sat empty at his right hand. For 10 years, the chair no one was ever allowed to use, the chair that had belonged in his mind to his mother. Helen, Adrian said, come sit here. Helen looked at the chair, and she knew what chair it was. Everyone in that house knew what that chair was. And she shook her head. Oh no, sir, not that one. That's not my place, Helen. I couldn't, sir. That's your mother's. Adrian pulled the chair out, the empty chair, the one that had been a shrine to helplessness for 10 years. And he held it for her the way a man holds a chair for someone he honors. You spent 15 years serving this table, Adrian said, and his voice was not entirely steady. 15 years standing against that wall while other people ate. Today the table serves you. Sit down, Helen, please. And Helen Brooks, who had served the Moretti family through terror and grief and everything else for 15 years, sat down in the chair at Adrian Moretti's right hand, the chair that had belonged to his dead mother. And she pressed her fingers to her mouth to keep from crying, and she could not manage it, and she cried anyway. And Adrian went into the kitchen himself, and he ladled out a bowl of soup with his own hands, and he carried it back and set it down in front of her, gently, with a small spoon beside it, And he served Helen Brooks the way she had served that table for 15 years. And the whole room was quiet, and nobody was standing against the walls. And for the first time in the long, dark history of Ravenwood Estate, the table was a place of love instead of fear. 2 years later, Ravenwood Estate was no longer the center of anything a man could be afraid of. The empire was gone. Not lost in a war, not seized in a night of violence, but taken apart, piece by Adrian's own hands and his own testimony. He had surrendered control of company after company. He had cooperated with the investigators the way he'd promised the lawyer he would. And it had cost him almost everything, exactly as they'd warned. Most of the fortune was gone. Some of it to seizures, some of it to lawyers, a great deal of it to the workers he'd freed and the debts he'd torn up and the reparations he'd quietly made to people who never knew who was making. And Adrian had answered for what he'd done. He had accepted legal consequences that a man with his old instincts would have died before accepting, and he had walked into them with eyes open because he had decided, somewhere along that long road of hard mornings, that the truth following him was better than the fear he used to hide behind. The estate itself remained, part of a negotiated settlement, a big quiet house that no longer frightened anyone. But the thing that had made Ravenwood terrible, the power, the name, the men against the walls, all of it was finished. And out of that wreckage, one thing had grown so strong and so bright that it had come to define everything. Lillian's table. 2 years in, it delivered thousands of meals a year, medically appropriate, gently made, carried to patients and caregivers all across New York. People going through the worst of chemotherapy. People who had forgotten how to eat because their bodies had turned against them. People sitting alone in kitchens, too scared and too sick to lift a fork. And every one of them, at some opened a door to find a warm meal made by someone who understood that you never force a hurting person to prove they're hungry. It had grown past anything Grace had imagined. It had volunteers, a real staff, a waiting list of people who wanted to help. And Grace ran it, not as Adrian's employee, not as a maid, not as a household coordinator, but as its executive director, a title on a door that still sometimes startled her when she saw it, because 5 years ago, she had been unable to walk into a kitchen without her chest caving in. And now she ran a whole organization built around the thing that had once broken her heart to touch. She trained every volunteer herself, and she always started them with the same lesson, the one her mother had put into her a lifetime ago in a small kitchen in Savannah. Never force someone who's hurting to prove that they're hungry, Grace would tell them, holding up a small spoon so they could see it. You don't come at a scared person with a big spoon and a full plate. That's a demand. And a demand is the last thing a frightened body can answer. You come with a little spoon and a little bit, and you make it a choice, and then you wait. You sit with them, and you don't push, and you let them find their own way back to the food. She'd set the spoon down. We are not here to fix people. We can't. Half the folks we feed aren't going to get better, and we love them anyway, and we feed them anyway, because nobody should leave this world feeling like they were a burden nobody wanted to bother with. Your job is not to save them. Your job is to remind them that life is still waiting, one small spoonful at a time. What they do with that reminder is theirs. Helen ran the household side of it, brisk and warm, and finally, after a lifetime of serving frightened people, serving people out of love, Dr. Lawson's nutrition program had become something other hospitals asked to copy. Thomas Avery's daughter kept the books honest to the last penny, and Thomas himself, safe and relocated and living quietly, had come to a few of the meal deliveries as a volunteer and had wept the first time and had kept coming anyway. And then, one cold winter morning in the second year, Grace got a phone call from a hospital that changed the shape of the day. There was a patient, an elderly man. His wife had died the week before, 60 years of marriage gone in a single Tuesday, and since her funeral he had refused food entirely. Days now, he would not eat. The nurses had tried everything, the doctors had tried everything, and he had turned his face to the wall and stopped, the way people stop. And the hospital had run out of ideas, and someone had heard about Lillian's table, and the woman who was supposed to be good with the ones who'd given up. He won't take anything, the nurse said over the phone. Not a bite. We're worried we're going to lose him. And it's not the illness that's going to take him, ma'am. It's the grief. He's decided to follow her. We can see it. We don't know what else to do. I'll come, Grace said. I'll come myself. She went to the kitchen at Ravenwood, which she still used for the deliveries, and she made a light broth. The plainest, gentlest broth she knew how to make. The same broth she had carried up a staircase 2 years ago to a man who'd decided to die. and she was packing it carefully to travel when Adrian stopped her in the doorway. He was different now at 50, or wherever the years had put him. Thinner in the way of a man who'd been ill and recovered, gray coming in at his temples, but steady, healthy, his hands quiet at his sides. The tremor was long gone. He ate 3 meals a day and slept through the night and had not had a drink in over 2 years. And the fear that had once lived behind his eyes had been replaced by something harder won and quieter. A grieving man who won't eat, Adrian said. He'd heard about the call. Sounds familiar. It usually does, Grace said. That's the job. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and took out a small wooden box, and he held it out to her. Before you go, he said, I want you to have this. Grace opened the box. Inside, on a folded cloth, was the teaspoon, the little teaspoon. The one she had set beside a bowl of broth 2 years ago in front of a man who was too afraid to eat. The one he had asked her to bring again the next morning. The one she had placed beside his hand at the Last Supper with Crowe, when the old animal had nearly won, and a small spoon had been the only thing to stop it. He had kept it. All this time in a wooden box, he had kept that one ordinary teaspoon. I can't take this, Grace said. Adrian, this is yours. This is the whole thing. This is everything that happened between us. You can't give this away. That's exactly why I'm giving it to you. Adrian folded her fingers around the box. Listen to me. This spoon belonged to the worst version of me. The man who could barely lift it to his mouth. The man who decided to die. The man who nearly gave Victor the nod at that dinner. That's whose spoon this is. His voice was rough. And then it became the proof that I could be someone else. Every time I saw it, I remembered that I picked it up myself that night when my hands were shaking, and I could have chosen to be the thing Crowe wanted me to be, and I chose different instead. He closed her hand tighter around the box. I've kept it locked in a box for 2 years like it was some kind of holy relic. And that's wrong. That's the same mistake I made my whole life, thinking the way to protect something precious is to lock it away where nothing can touch it. Important things aren't meant to be locked in boxes, Grace. They're meant to be used. That spoon should be out there, in a hospital, in some scared person's hand, doing what it did for me. Take it. Let it keep working. Grace looked down at the small spoon in the small box, and her eyes filled, and she did not argue anymore, because she understood that he was right, and because she understood that this was, in its own quiet way, the last piece of the man, learning to give things away instead of holding them in a fist. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll take it. She drove to the hospital with the broth still warm and the little spoon in her pocket, and she found the room, and she found the old man exactly as they described him, turned toward the wall, gray and still, a man who had made the same decision Adrian had once made, that life without the person he loved was not a life worth staying for, that the door to food and the door to living were the same door, and he was going to keep them both shut until the end came. Grace did not turn on any brightness or bustle around him. She did not announce herself as help. She pulled a chair up beside the bed, quietly, and she sat down, and for a while she said nothing at all. Because the first thing her mother had ever taught her was that you sit with a person before you ever try to feed them. My name's Grace, she said after a while. I heard you lost your wife last week. I'm not going to tell you I'm sorry. Because everybody's told you that, and it doesn't do a thing, does it? 60 years, they told me. 60 years is not a thing a person gets over in a week, or a year, or ever really. You just learn to carry it. She let the quiet sit. I lost my mother a long time ago. I couldn't walk into a kitchen for 10 years afterward. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend I understand exactly what you're feeling, because your grief is yours, and it's the size of 60 years. But I know a little about the shape of it, and I know that right now, eating feels like a betrayal. Like if you take one bite, you're saying it's okay that she's gone, and it's not okay, so you won't. The old man's eyes moved, just barely, but they moved toward her. Grace took the broth out and poured a little into a cup, and she took the small spoon out of her pocket. Adrian's spoon. The worst version of a man's spoon that had become the proof he could change, and she filled it just a little, and she held it, not toward the man's mouth, not close enough to be a demand, just where he could see it. This is a real small spoon, Grace said gently, the smallest one I've got. I brought it on purpose. Because a big spoon, that's somebody telling you to eat, and you've had enough people telling you what to do this week to last a lifetime. But a little spoon like this, that's just a choice. That's all it is. You can take it, or you can leave it. And either way, I'm going to sit right here with you, and I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to think less of you for one single second if you turn your face back to that wall. She held the spoon steady, and she waited. The old man looked at it, And then he turned his face away, back toward the wall, and Grace's heart ached. But she did not move, and she did not sigh. And she did not let one flicker of disappointment reach her face, because disappointment is a demand too. Disappointment says, "You failed me." And a grieving person does not need one more way to feel they've failed. She just waited. Minutes passed. Long ones. She did not fill them with talk. She let them be quiet, the way her mother had taught her, the way she had once let a mafia boss sit in silence over a bowl of broth until his body remembered it was allowed to say yes. She sat with a stranger's grief the way she'd sat with her mother's dying, and her own mother's promise moved through her, steady as a heartbeat. Feed someone who has forgotten that life is still waiting for them. And after a long time, the old man turned his head back. He looked at the small spoon, still there, still waiting, held by a woman who had not left and had not pushed and had not made him feel like a burden. And something in his face, some small thing that had been shut, opened just a crack. The way a door opens when it hasn't been forced, but only finally invited. He leaned forward barely, and he took the spoonful. One taste, that was all. One small taste of plain warm broth from the smallest spoon Grace had. But his body did not reject it, and his eyes closed, and a tear ran down the side of his face into the pillow. And Grace understood that it was not the broth he was tasting. It was the memory of being cared for. It was the reminder, arriving through his grief, that he was still here, that life was still, against all his wishes, waiting for him, and that someone had bothered to sit down and hold out a small spoon and let him find his own way back. "There you go," Grace said softly. "That's all. Just that. You don't have to do any more than that today." But he took a second spoonful. And she understood that the door had opened, and that the rest would come in its own time, the way it had for a frightened man in a mansion 2 years before, one small yes, leading to the next. And she sat with him a long time and did not rush a moment of it. That evening, back at Ravenwood on a Sunday afternoon, that had become the most important tradition in Grace's life, they all gathered for a meal. It was not a grand thing. It was a modest table, in a house that no longer intimidated anyone, and the people around it were the people who had survived the fire together. Adrian was there, healthy, quiet, at peace, in a way the old Adrian could never have imagined. Helen was there, retired now from Ravenwood, but never from any of them, sitting in what had become simply her chair. Victor was there, softer than he'd been, a man who had learned along with his boss that there was another way to live. Dr. Lawson was there, and several volunteers from Lillian's table, ordinary people who had found their way to the work, and who had no idea, most of them, what this house had once been, and who did not need to know, because it was something else now. There were no servants standing against the walls. There were no frightened men waiting for orders. There was just a table full of people who had chosen, one hard morning at a time, to build something out of love instead of fear. Adrian rose and lifted his glass, and everyone quieted, expecting perhaps a speech, because there had been a time when Adrian Moretti's words at a table could decide the course of a man's life. He did not give a speech. "Thank you," Adrian said simply, "for staying long enough to meet the man I should have been." And he sat back down. That was all. And it was more than any speech could have been, because everyone at that table knew what it had cost him to become that man, knew the empire he'd surrendered and the fear he'd walked away from and the consequences he'd accepted, and knew that the quiet, gray-haired man raising a glass to them was the hardest thing Adrian Moretti had ever built, harder than any empire, because he'd built it out of the wreckage of himself. Grace looked down at her place setting. Beside her plate, small and ordinary, lay the little teaspoon, Adrian's spoon. She had brought it home from the hospital, and she carried it now everywhere, from delivery to delivery, and she had set it beside her own plate tonight without quite meaning to, out of habit, the way her hands had always measured out that extra half portion. And she thought about her mother. She thought about Lillian Holloway in a small kitchen in Savannah, holding her daughter's hand at the end and asking for a promise. "When I'm gone, feed someone who has forgotten that life is still waiting for them." She thought about the 10 years she had believed she'd failed that promise. The 10 years she couldn't walk into a kitchen. The 10 years she'd told herself she'd keep her word someday when it stopped hurting. And it had never. She understood now that she had not failed. She understood that the grief had not broken the promise. It had only delayed it, held it in the dark, the way a seed waits under winter ground. The promise had been alive the whole time, waiting, and it had walked her into a dining room 2 years ago in a cheap uniform, and it had walked her up a staircase with a bowl of broth, and it had grown into a table that fed thousands, and it had carried her that very morning to an old man's bedside with the smallest spoon she owned. She had kept the promise. She was keeping it still. She would keep it for the rest of her life, and it would outlive her, in Helen and in Dr. Lawson and in every volunteer she trained to hold out a small spoon and wait. Her mother had asked her to feed one person. She had built a table that would feed people long after she was gone. And here at the end is the truth this whole story was always reaching toward. And it is worth saying plainly, because it is the thing that matters. A meal cannot erase a man's crimes. A bowl of soup does not wash blood from anyone's hands, and no amount of kindness undoes the harm a person has caused. Adrian Moretti was not redeemed by broth, and Grace never once pretended he was. He answered for what he did. He lost his empire, his fortune, and his freedom to consequences he'd earned, and that was right. And that was just, and no plate of food changed a single thing about what he owed. But genuine care can remind a person that change is still possible. That is all it can do, and it is not small. It cannot force the change, and it cannot excuse what came before, and it cannot promise the change will hold. It can only knock softly, with something the frightened part of a person remembers from before it got scared, and open a door. And once that door is open, once a person is reminded that life is still waiting for them, the choice becomes theirs, and so does the responsibility. Adrian was reminded, and then every hard morning for the rest of his life, he had to choose, and he did. The most powerful thing that had ever existed inside Ravenwood Estate was never Adrian Moretti's money, or his guards, or his name, or the fear that had made grown men careful in his presence for 20 years. It was a small spoon held by a woman who understood that broken people do not always need to be commanded, or fixed, or saved. Sometimes they only need to be patiently, gently, and without any pressure at all, invited back to life. And the invitation was enough. That Sunday, after the others had gone home, and the volunteers had carried the last dishes to the kitchen, Grace stayed behind at the long table with Adrian, and the small teaspoon lay between them, and neither of them was in a hurry to leave. And in the quiet that settled over the room, Grace found herself thinking about a question that had followed her all through the 2 years. A question she had never quite said out loud, which was this: what actually happened here? What was the thing that passed between a maid and a monster and changed them both? People wanted to call it love, and they weren't wrong. But they meant the small kind, the kind in song. And that was not what this was. This was something older and harder and truer, and she had spent 2 years learning its shape. And now, at the end of everything, she thought she finally understood it. The first thing she understood was that love, the real kind, is not a feeling. It is an attention. She had learned this from her mother before she had words for it. Lillian Holloway had not saved a single one of the dying people she fed for 30 years. Not one. She loved them anyway fully, and the love was not in her heart, or not only there. It was in the small spoon. It was in the way she sat down before she tried to feed anyone. It was in the half portion, and the patience, and the refusal to make a frightened body prove anything. Love, in her mother's hands, was a kind of paying attention so complete that the person being loved could feel it in their body, could feel that someone had noticed exactly where they were hurting and had come to meet them there instead of demanding they come out to be met. That was the whole secret. Most people, when they say they love someone, mean they have strong feelings in the vicinity of that person. Grace's mother had taught her that love is something you do with your attention, and that a feeling you never turn into attention is not love at all. It is just weather passing through you. Adrian had never been loved that way in his adult life. And that was the second thing Grace understood. He had been feared, which is the counterfeit of love, the thing that looks like it from a distance and is its exact opposite up close. Fear and love both make a room go quiet when you walk in. Fear and love both make people careful with you. But fear makes people careful so they can survive you, and love makes people careful so they can honor you. And Adrian had spent 20 years mistaking the first for the second because he had forgotten there was a difference. He had built a whole empire designed to make people careful with him, and he had ended up the loneliest man in the city, because you cannot be loved by people who are trying to survive you. Fear pushes everyone to the walls of the room. Love brings them to the table. He had a house full of people pressed against the walls, and he had called it power, and it was actually the most complete poverty a human being can know. And here is the thing that Grace turned over most. In the quiet, the reason Adrian could not eat was, in the end, a failure of love. Not a lack of it from others, though there was that. A failure to receive it. His stomach had turned against food, yes, and the doctors were right about the ulcer and the stress. But underneath the medicine, there was a man who had made himself untouchable, and an untouchable man cannot be fed because feeding is the most intimate, ordinary act there is. To eat what someone else has made for you is to trust them with your body. To let another person nourish you is to admit you cannot do everything alone, that you are creatures with needs, that you can be reached. Adrian had spent 2 decades making himself unreachable, and then his own body had presented him with the bill, because a human being is not built to be unreachable, and the body knows it even when the mind has forgotten. He could not swallow, because he had made himself a man no one was allowed to feed. And the cure, the real cure underneath the prescriptions, was to become a man who could be fed again, to become reachable, to let love in through the smallest possible door, 1 teaspoon wide. That was why the spoon worked when the specialists failed. Not because it was magic, but because it was small enough to slip past 20 years of armor. A great feast is a demand, and Adrian had spent his life refusing demands. But a teaspoon of broth is not a demand. It is an offer so small and so gentle that even a man who has made himself untouchable can accept it without feeling that he has surrendered. Love, Grace understood, almost always has to enter that way, through the smallest door, because the people who most need it are exactly the people who have built the highest walls. And you do not get over a high wall with a grand gesture. You get through it with something so small and so patient that the wall does not even notice it has been breached until the loving is already done. The third thing Grace understood was harder, and it was about the limits of love. And it was the thing that kept her honest for 2 years. Love had opened Adrian's door. It had not walked through it for him. This mattered more than anything, and she had said it to him 100 times in 100 ways. Because the whole culture wants to believe that love saves people. That if you just love someone enough, they will change. They will heal. They will become the person you see underneath. And it is a beautiful lie, and it is a lie, and it has broken more lives than almost any other belief a person can hold. Grace had watched people give themselves entirely to that lie, pour every drop of themselves into loving someone broken, certain that the love would fix them, and she had watched them drown, while the broken person stayed exactly as broken as before. Because love does not fix anyone. Love cannot. Love can only remind a person that they are worth fixing and then stand back and let them do the fixing themselves or not. Adrian had been reminded. That was what the soup did. It reached past his armor and reminded him, in the only language his body still spoke, that he was worth caring for, that life was still waiting for him, that there was a version of himself buried under 20 years of fear that a small warm bowl still knew how to reach. But every single thing after that reminder, he had to do himself. He had to take the medicine. He had to visit the grave. He had to sit in the therapist's office and say the things. He had to dismantle the empire, morning after morning, choice after choice. And Grace could not do 1 ounce of it for him. And she never tried, because she knew that the moment she tried to carry his change for him, she would be robbing him of the only thing that could make it real, which was that it was his. Love that tries to do the changing for the beloved is not love anymore. It is a kind of theft. It steals the person's own becoming. Real love holds out the spoon and then agonizingly keeps its hands to itself and lets the other person choose to lift it. This was the discipline of it, the part nobody puts in the songs. Grace had sat beside an old man that very morning and watched him turn his face to the wall, and every instinct in her had wanted to push the spoon closer, to coax, to insist, to love him hard enough to make him eat. And she had done the hardest thing love ever asks, which is to want something for a person so badly and still not force it, to hold out the offer and then let it be genuinely refusable, because an offer that cannot be refused is not an offer. It is a demand wearing love's face, and a demand can never nourish anyone. She had let him be free to turn away, and it was only because she let him be free to turn away that he had been free to turn back. That was the terrible arithmetic of it. You cannot give a person the freedom to say yes without also giving them the freedom to say no. And if you take away the no to protect them, you have taken away the yes as well, and you are left with obedience, which is what Adrian used to go collect, and which had left him starving in a mansion full of it. And this, Grace realized, was the exact same lesson Adrian had spent 2 years learning from the other direction. She had learned that love cannot force change. He had learned that protection cannot force safety. They were the same lesson, wearing different clothes. Adrian had tried to keep everyone he cared about safe by controlling them, by taking away their choices, by locking his mother's memory in a shrine, and locking Grace behind the estate gates, and locking a spoon in a wooden box, and all his controlling had never once made anyone safe, least of all himself. Because you cannot cage a person into safety any more than you can force a person into love. The caging and the forcing come from the same fearful root, the belief that if you just hold tightly enough, you can keep the thing you love from being lost. And it is the tightest grip that loses everything. Adrian had learned that his mother, whom he could not save, could only be honored by letting go of the fear her death had planted in him. He had learned that grace could only be kept by being freed. He had learned that the spoon could only be precious by being given away. Every important thing in his life, he learned, is held by opening the hand, not closing it. That is the whole physics of love, and it runs exactly opposite to the physics of fear. And a man cannot practice both at once, which is why he'd had to choose, and why the choosing had cost him an empire. There was a fourth thing, and it was the one Grace held closest, because it was about her mother, and about grief, and about what love does after the person you love is gone. For 10 years she had believed that her love for her mother had turned into an inability to enter a kitchen, that grief had frozen the love solid, that the promise she'd made was a debt she was too broken to pay. And she had learned over these 2 years that this was not what had happened at all. The love had never frozen. It had been working the whole time, underground, in the dark, the way a root works in winter. The reason she could not enter a kitchen was not that her love had died. It was that her love was so alive, so enormous, that a kitchen was unbearable, because a kitchen was where her mother most fully was. The grief was not the absence of love. The grief was the love with nowhere left to go, backing up in her like water behind a dam. And the promise had not been broken by the 10 years. The promise had been waiting for the 10 years to do their slow work, waiting for the love to find somewhere to go. And when it finally found somewhere, when it walked into a dining room and saw a starving man in the middle of plenty, all that dammed up love had come pouring through, and it had built a table that fed thousands. This was the deepest thing Grace understood, and she thought her mother had known it all along. Love does not end when the person dies, it changes address. Her mother had spent 30 years loving dying strangers, and every one of them had died, and none of that love was wasted, because love is not a transaction that fails when the beloved is lost. Love is a thing you become, and once you have become it, it flows out of you toward whoever is in front of you, forever. Her mother's love had not died with her mother. It had moved into Grace, and then it had moved through Grace into an old man in a hospital bed that very morning, and it would move through the volunteers Grace trained, and through them into people not yet born. That was what Lillian's table really was. It was one woman's love, refusing to die, finding address after address, generation after generation. Her mother had asked her to feed one person. But love, once it is truly alive in someone, cannot be contained to one person. It overflows. It always overflows. That is how you know it is the real thing and not the counterfeit. Fear contracts, love overflows. And so, Grace thought, sitting at that quiet table with the small spoon between them, the story was never really about a maid curing a mafia boss, and it was never really about broth, and it was not even, in the shallow sense, a love story between a man and a woman, because that was never what grew between her and Adrian, and she was glad it wasn't, because what grew between them was rarer and would last longer. It was two people teaching each other the same truth from opposite ends of it. She had shown him that love is an attention you pay, that it enters through the smallest door, that it can only remind and never force. He had shown her, without meaning to, that love withheld becomes fear, that a grip too tight loses everything, that the only way to keep a precious thing is to open your hand. And between the two of them, they had assembled the whole lesson the one her mother had died knowing, and Adrian had nearly died not knowing, which is that love is not the thing that saves people. Love is the thing that reminds people they are worth saving, and then has the courage to let them save themselves. Adrian broke the silence at last. He picked up the small spoon from where it lay between them and turned it over in his fingers, and then he set it back down, closer to her, the way she had once set it closer to him. "You know what I finally figured out," he said. "All those years I thought I was protecting the people I loved. My mother's memory, you, myself. I thought love meant building walls high enough that nothing could ever get in and take what I cared about." He shook his head slowly. "And every wall I built it out of fear, and I called it love, and it did the exact opposite of what love does. It kept everyone out, including the people I was trying to protect, including me." He looked at her. "You never built a single wall. You just kept opening doors, small ones, one spoon wide. And you got further into people in one afternoon than I got in 20 years of walls. That's not because I'm better than you," Grace said gently. "It's because my mother taught me young, and yours died before she could finish. You had to learn it the hard way. Most people who learn it at all learn it the hard way. She picked up the spoon. The ones who learn it easy are lucky. The ones who learn it hard are the ones who end up teaching it. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Is that what we're doing? Teaching it? That old man this morning, Grace said. In 60 years of marriage, somebody loved him the way my mother loved people. You can tell. The ones who are loved like that, they're the hardest to feed when they're grieving, because they know exactly what they lost. And someday, if he heals enough, he's going to sit beside somebody else who's given up, and he's going to know how to wait, because I waited with him. That's how it goes. Nobody who's ever really been loved keeps it. It moves through them. It has to. Love that stops moving isn't love anymore. It's just a memory of love, and a memory can't feed anybody. She stood and slipped the small spoon into her pocket where it lived now. My mother's love is going to outlive me by 100 years, and she never had a dollar or a name or a single thing you'd call power. That's the only kind of power that lasts, the kind you give away. And that was the truth the whole story had been reaching toward. And it deserves to be said as plainly as a woman setting a bowl in front of a frightened man. The world believes that love is a feeling that happens to you, and it is not. Love is an attention you choose to pay, it again and again, especially when it is hard, especially when the person cannot be fixed, especially when they turn their face to the wall. The world believes that if you love someone enough, you can save them, and you cannot. You can only remind them they are worth saving, and then honor their freedom to choose. The world believes that you keep the people and things you love by holding them tighter, and you lose them exactly that way. You keep them by opening your hand. And the world believes that when the person you love dies, the love dies too. And it does not. It changes address and flows out of you into whoever is hurting in front of you for as long as you live and past it. A single teaspoon of broth could not cure an ulcer, and it could not wash the blood from a guilty man's hands, and it could not bring one dead mother back. But held out gently without demand, by someone paying complete attention, it could remind a dying man that life was still waiting for him. And that reminder, small as it was, 1 spoon wide, was the truest act of love there is, because it asked for nothing, and it forced nothing, and it left the other person free. That is what love is. Not the grand feast, but the small spoon. Not the wall that keeps everyone out, but the door held open 1 careful inch. Not the grip that clutches, but the hand that gives away its most precious thing, so that thing can keep on doing its quiet work in the world. Grace Holloway had learned it from her mother, and she had taught it to a man everyone else had only feared. And now it lived in 100 volunteers and 1,000 meals, and a small worn teaspoon that traveled from bedside to bedside, and it would never stop, because love that has learned to give itself away cannot be stopped, cannot be caged, cannot be killed, and cannot ever, ever be locked in a box. It can only be handed gently to the next hurting person who has forgotten that life is still waiting for them. And that is enough. That has always been enough. That is the only thing that ever was.